Russia is the largest country in the world. And as you can imagine, airplanes are absolutely essential. We're talking about a mega territory with 11 different time zones, and where the capital city, Moscow, has 3 international airports and the 3rd most powerful aviation sector in the world. To give you an idea, more than 60% of the Russian territory is accessible only by air. And right here comes the plot twist. What if I told you that getting on a plane in Russia is becoming quite a high-risk sport?
Russian aircraft incidents have tripled in 2023 as airlines struggle to maintain plans.
Since the war began, Russia has lost approximately 300 civilian aircraft to breakdowns. And while fatal accidents are fortunately not on the rise, the chances of being involved in incidents of all kinds increased threefold in 2023 alone. We're talking about more than 180 incidents in a single year. According to the Wall Street Journal, while in 2019 Russian flights recorded 4.5 incidents per 100,000 flights, that figure has skyrocketed to 9.9. So you see, since Russia launched the invasion of Ukraine, things have only gotten worse. So who or what is responsible? You got it, international sanctions. The sanctions have prohibited Russia from importing spare parts for the maintenance of its Western Boeing and Airbus aircraft. And not only that, sanctions have also blocked business with leasing companies that lend their aircraft and control a large part of the world's air fleet. The data speak for themselves. Take a look. At the time Russia invaded Ukraine, more than 80% of the fleet of Russia's 20 largest airlines was composed of Western aircraft, mainly Boeing and Airbus. Similarly, when Putin's regime decided to unleash its war of terror against Ukraine, Western aircraft leasing companies were providing just over 500 aircraft, almost half of the total aircraft operating in the country. But after the invasion, these companies, applying international sanctions, terminated the contracts in force and demanded the return of some 440 aircraft owned by them. However, those planes were never returned. In other words, they were stolen. So what did the Russians do? Basically, they changed the license plates to Russian ones and restricted operations to domestic routes or to countries that were not applying international sanctions. Logically, this served to prevent the aircraft from being seized and handed over to their rightful owners, which is exactly what would happen if any of these aircraft landed at an international airport. For example, when sanctions were implemented, 76 aircraft that were struck outside Russia were requisitioned and delivered back to their owners. VisualPolitik community, the Russian authorities' decision to carry out a massive aircraft theft was seen as a dual response to the sanctions on its airline industry. First, because taking over the Western aircraft fleet was the only way for them to guarantee the supply of seats in the local market. Remember that we are not talking about 5, 10, or 20% of the vehicles, but about almost 50% of the total fleet. But secondly, by stealing these aircraft, they could, in a way, circumvent the lack of components for in-flight aircraft maintenance. How? Well, it's very easy. They strip or dismantle an aircraft to supply components to another one. Now, many of you may be wondering at this point, but if they have no Western supplies, and it's been over 2 years, what exactly are the airlines doing to be able to continue operating Western aircraft? Think about it. Commercial aircraft need constant and uninterrupted maintenance. So if they keep flying, something unusual must be going on, right? Well, if Russia has innovated in anything in recent years, it has been precisely in learning how to circumvent Western sanctions.
Playing dodgeball.
Russia has had to reinvent itself in an attempt to maintain, or at least appear to maintain, some semblance of normalcy. For example, the closure of McDonald's franchises has given rise to its Russian copy, Vkusna Itochka. Starbucks coffee is now Stars Coffee, and the Coca-Cola substitute is Cool Cola. For some, these changes mark an opportunity, even a favorable one for Russia. Look at this.
How Putin turned a Western boycott into a bonanza.
Of course, beyond a sprint that tends to be rather short-lived, these changes often entail problems of competitiveness and quality. Proof of this can be found in Latin America's import substitution policy. Be that as it may, the point is that implementing this shift away from Western suppliers in the aviation sector is much more complicated than switching hamburgers. First, because the technology required is at a much higher level. And second, because everything surrounding the world of aviation is subject to very strict rules to ensure ensure aviation safety. In fact, each country has an aviation agency that is in charge of ensuring that all these rules are complied with, and if they are not, airlines lose their permission to fly in that country's airspace. As you can imagine, Russia also has its own aviation agency, Rosaviatsia, and the question is, how can they maintain their fleets in size and safety if the import of Western-approved parts and machinery is under sanctions? Well, they are doing it in several ways. To begin with, one of the strategies is to send some older aircraft to be scrapped in order to make use of their parts, even if they are not aircraft of the same model. We're talking about parts such as brakes, relays, cables, and much more. Then, another strategy being pursued is to modify the piloting style of aircraft to try to reduce wear and tear on parts. Do you want an example? The brakes.
Due to sanctions, some Aeroflot aircraft may have to land with brakes deactivated.
You see, before landing, pilots activate what is known as automatic brakes, or auto brakes. This is a system that starts braking the aircraft constantly as soon as it touches the runway, and has different intensities depending on the desired braking distance. Well, the situation has reached such an extreme that Russian airlines are having to avoid using this system in order to ration the use of landing gear brakes as much as possible, due to the difficulty of finding spare parts. That means in many landings, they are only using the reverse function of the engines, which are much more ineffective in braking the aircraft compared to auto brakes. As mind-boggling as it sounds, this is what may explain why news items like these are more frequent lately.
Smartavia Boeing 737-800 overruns runway at Perm Airport, Russia. Nordstar Airlines operated Boeing 737 overshoots Siberian runway in Russia. Russian regulator alerts operators after recent series of runway excursions.
But beware, this is only one example. Let's take a look at another case. As you probably know, Russia also has its own aircraft manufacturers, such as Tupolev and Sukhoi, manufacturers who, nevertheless, also needed many Western components that were indispensable for the manufacture of their devices. To give you an idea, one of the best-selling aircraft in Russia for domestic flights is the Sukhoi Superjet 100, an aircraft that, not surprisingly, was developed before the international sanctions. Well, it is estimated that between 30 and 60% of all the components in this model came from the West. Something similar is happening with the Yakovlev MC-21, a passenger aircraft of up to 211 seats, being developed by a subsidiary of state-owned Rostec. VisualPolitik community, this aircraft was destined to be the technological jewel of the Russian medium-range fleet. However, once the Western technology tap was turned off, let's just say that the targets have been a bit lacking. And among the many Western components that this aircraft had, starting with the avionics, were also the engines. The MC-21 was to be equipped with two US-made Pratt & Whitney PW1400G engines, very similar to those fitted on the Airbus A320neo. Well, now it will no longer be able to carry them. And of course, to solve this setback, the Russians are having to make a living. For now, the solution they have found has been to modify the Aviad Vigatel PS90, an old Russian engine that began development in 1983, into the new Aviad Vigatel PD14. This, among other things, is what explains news stories like this.
Serial production of the Russian MC-21 airliner further delayed to 2025-26.
And that's a best-case scenario. It remains to be seen exactly when this plane ends up going into service. Be that as it may, the point is that to try to solve, or at least mitigate all these problems we have described, the Russians are endeavoring to do essentially three things. The first is to import components for its Western aircraft through other, let's say, less direct channels. Ural Airlines, for example, one of Russia's largest airlines, has imported more than 20 US-made components since the war broke out in Ukraine, and this is no exception. Russian airlines bought at least $1.2 billion worth of parts for their aircraft between May 2022 and June 2023. According to a Reuters analysis. And if we take into account purchases by other companies, the actual figures may be much higher. We're talking about purchases ranging from cabin pressure valves, screens, landing gear parts, and even coffee makers, toilet seats, and crew interphones. The purchase of components manufactured by Northrop Grumman has even been detected. Now, you may be wondering, how did all that get to Russia in the midst of a huge barrage of sanctions? Well, according to customs records, Russia is bringing all this into the country country through intermediaries in Tajikistan, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, China, and Kyrgyzstan, among other countries. These are countries that have not fully adhered to Western sanctions against the Russian aviation industry. The purchases achieved in this way obviously are not enough, but at least they serve to mitigate the problem. Then, the second thing that Russia is doing is to gradually buy back the aircraft that Russia stole in 2022 from Western leasing companies. The idea is that, in this way, the planes can leave Russia, not only to operate international routes for which they are running out of aircraft, but surely also so they can receive some maintenance abroad. And so, according to the most recent data, Russian airlines, with the help of the state, have already spent more than $2.5 billion on legally purchasing some 170 aircraft from Western leasing companies. However, some 230 are still left and are still technically stolen. And take note, because contrary to what some of you might think, the fact that Russia is buying these aircraft is the best case scenario for their Western owners. According to a Cirium survey, 67% of players in the aviation market believe that if Russia were to return these aircraft, less than a quarter of them could be used in the market. Why? Well, because of the modifications and alterations that the Russians are making to be able to fly them. For example, using unauthorized parts or parts that correspond to other models. And keep in mind that the survey is from 2022. The situation now could be much worse. Now, where the heck is all this money coming from to buy planes, along with nearly $2 billion in compensation to the airlines? Well, it's mainly coming out of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund. And components are not the only thing they're spending on, not at all.
Russian splashes $12 billion to keep aviation sector in the air.
In 2023 alone, the equivalent of some $4.5 billion of public money has been spent on the aviation sector. Truly outrageous. Russia is burning the midnight oil to keep this transport system operational. And remember that the figures could grow, and grow a lot in the near future. Basically, Russia has designed a whole macro plan to save its aviation sector from collapse in the coming years. We're talking about the 2030 Aviation Manufacturing Plan, which, flush with public money, is the hope of Putin and his mates to prevent the country going backwards a century in transportation. Do you want to know a little bit about it? Well, let's take a look.
The macro plan.
In June 2022, the Russian government realized that aviation had a few problems. Western sanctions were wreaking havoc, and overnight, domestic manufacturers were running out of components and technologies, including software, that were absolutely crucial to making their aircraft. The risk of collapse in the medium term was, and to some extent is, real. So, something had to happen. So, no sooner said than done. The Kremlin then presented a program requiring the state-owned industrial conglomerate Rostec to manufacture at least 1,036 aircraft with 100% indigenous components by 2030. It's a huge challenge because they have not yet managed to achieve self-sufficiency in even one of their passenger aircraft models. To give you an idea, the model with the most local components, the new Superjet 100 SSJ New, is in the testing phase with 97% Russian components. Well, in order to achieve this, which in theory seems almost impossible, at the beginning of 2024, the state has started to release millions as if there were no tomorrow. For example, in January, the Russian state allocated a first spending package of $3.1 billion to help the Russian aviation industry finance the production of 609 100% indigenous aircraft. We're talking about aircraft that seek to replace all Western aircraft in Russian fleets by 2030. They don't want a single one left. So what's the problem? That the Russian government believes it could stay ahead of its own aerospace industry's capabilities. Come on, it's a repeat of what they did with their military when they invaded Ukraine, believing that they were much better than they really were. It's the same old story. In fact, the state-owned United Aircraft Corporation, which brings together Russia's largest aircraft manufacturers and is 92% owned by Rostec, failed to produce a single passenger aircraft in 2023. The reality, beyond the plans, is that total import substitution is proving difficult, and the targets set by the government for 2023 have not been met. That's the first blow. According to Wilson Center analysts, at the current rate, it would be difficult for UAC to manufacture more than 12 100% indigenous narrow-body aircraft by 2030. That's 12 against a target of 1,036 aircraft. And maybe, in the best-case scenario, they could make a few more for short routes like the Baikal, which is basically a light aircraft. So, the Russian government's plan will most likely fail, or be changed along the way. In fact, it is very likely that the announcement of this macro plan for the Russian aircraft industry is nothing more than another smokescreen, another propaganda ad aimed at the local public. See how good Putin is. He's doing something for us, and on top of that, he's going to put our national industry at the forefront. The reality, however, is that all that money being pumped into the Russian aviation industry will probably end up disappearing with never-ending and unproductive contracts in a sector that no longer has any competition, and no one will be able to complain. And naturally, many of the executives and oligarchs who run the sector will siphon off their share of these funds, while Putin's regime will turn a blind eye so that everyone remains loyal. Since UAC and Rostec will probably not meet the targets, Russian airlines will have to make do with old foreign aircraft and buy spare parts from third parties as they are doing so far. And while we cannot know if Russia will run out of aircraft, it is likely that its aging fleet will rack up more and more problems that will escalate in severity. VisualPolitik viewers, in this industry, sanctions are having an effect. The Russian aviation sector is drowning, plans to get out of the doldrums are failing, and along the way, the Russian government is losing billions of dollars. For now, Russia has tools to mitigate the effects of sanctions in the short term, but on a longer time frame, the outlook is much bleaker for this country. On VisualPolitik, we will be keeping a close eye on what happens. But for now, having come this far, the floor is yours. Do you think that Western sanctions on Russian aviation will condemn the country to be left without modern aircraft? Or, on the contrary, do you think they will manage to develop an independent industry? Would you dare to get on a plane in Russia as things stand today? Well, leave us your opinions below in the comments and let's start a debate. If you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any news. Once again, thank you very much for being there. All the best and see you next time.